much awaited moment of the conference, Transplant Pathology Interesting Cases. I now invite Dr. Vinita Batra, GP Pant Hospital, New Delhi, Dr. Swarnalata Gauri Shankar, Apollo Hospital, Hyderabad, and Dr. Radhika Krishna Patil, Director and Consultant Nepropathologist at Sri Balaji Diagnostics, Hyderabad, to chair the session. I also welcome Dr. Vinita Agarwal, SGP GIMS Lucknow, as the moderator. And the speakers are Dr. Sita Lakshmi Ames Kochi, Dr. Anila Abraham Chennai, Dr. Alok Sharma Lalpat Lab New Delhi, Dr. Srinivas Jipma Puducherry, Dr. Mukul Vich Rela Hospital Chennai, and Dr. Satish Rao. Over to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers and especially Dr. Pallav for this session. We always await for this session in all conferences because it gives us a lot of knowledge about the spectrum of transplant pathology. So this session will have speakers, the first four speakers will be talking about renal transplant pathology. So the first four speakers will be talking about renal transplant cases, and then we will have the liver transplant cases. So I will start with requesting Dr. Sita Lakshmi to present the first case. Dr. Sita Lakshmi is professor and head at the Department of Pathology at AIIMS Kochi, that is Amrita Institute at Kochi. Dr. Sita Lakshmi, please.
Thank you, Pallav, thank you, Dr. Vinita and the ISOT team for this invite. And this is an opportunity to meet friends online. So going straight into the case, this is a case of a 47-year-old lady who had a renal transplant for unknown native kidney disease. Her husband gave the kidney, and there was a graft dysfunction within 3 days of the transplant, and she was on a triple immunosuppression, and a renal allograft biopsy was received on the 7th day. It was a single corticomedullary core, 2 centimeter, with which came in formalin. It had 7 glomeruli, 1 was obsolescent, and it had glomerulitis. And John Silver, if you see, there are infiltrating lymphocytes, but the score was not coming to T2, so it was T1 only, less than 4 cells. And there was inflammation in the unscarred area, I2. And there was one vessel which is showing a vasculitis. It was a tangential section, and PTCs were showing few cells in some of them, but it was not coming to 10% of the PTCs. So V1 PTC 0 and C4D was negative. So the diagnosis was an acute T-cell mediated rejection, grade 2A, with a possible antibody mediated component because of the glomerulitis, but it was C4D negative. And she was pulsed with methylprednisolone and ATG. So after that, in 2017, she developed post-transplant diabetes, and she was started on oral anti-hypoglycemic. And in 2017, she had diarrhea, and a gastromedicine consultation was done, but it was normal colonoscopy, endoscopy, and the negative workup for opportunistic infection, CMV, and colitis. And it was thought to be MMF-induced diarrhea, and MMF was switched to azathioprine, and she had symptomatic relief. In 2019 February, again she had diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting, and raised inflammatory markers. Stool occurred blood was positive, and there was mild graft dysfunction. The serum creatinine was 2. She was treated with the parenteral antibiotic and IV fluid at that time. She responded. The creatinine came back to 1.6. Then 6 years post-transplant, she developed fever, cough, and COVID test was negative. There was ARDS, respiratory failure requiring ventilatory support at that time, but BAL was negative. And a negative workup for atypical pneumonia or sputum. And she responded to echinocandins and antibiotic. At discharge, the serum creatinine was 1.6, and the TC was 4,900. At 7.5 years post-transplant, she developed abdominal pain which is persistent, and the graft kidney was looking normal on ultrasound. Urine culture showed E. coli. There was anemia, severe graft dysfunction at that time. The serum creatinine was 5.7, and there was raised inflammatory markers. Procalcitonin was more than 100, CRP was 270, and she went into anuria, metabolic acidosis, and she was taken up for hemodialysis. So the CT actually showed pneumoperitoneum with distal ileal perforation, just contained sealed off perforation in the mid ileum. So gastrosurgery consultation was done. They resected a small segment of the ileum where it was perforated and anastomosed. Okay, that was the specimen we got. That's the site of perforation with the irregular mucosa. That's a cut section. So the wall was thickened and there was a gray white area in the wall which is expanding the wall, and this was the area of perforation. So there were two areas like this with the perforated, but there was no background abnormalities, no inflammation or granularity or ulcers in the background mucosa. So it is an infiltrative pathology which is multifocal with perforation. So what we saw on microscopy, the ulcerated mucosa, this is from the area of perforation, and this was on the side which was just showing a diffuse infiltrate of cells, and which was more looking like lymphoid. There was no formations of no glands or nesting or anything like that. It was a diffuse infiltrate of lymphoid cells, which was medium sized with open chromatin, and some of them showing small nucleoli. You can also see small lymphoid cells in between. There were mitosis also. So that is a higher power. And so the morphological diagnosis was a lymphoproliferative disorder, most likely NHL with perforation. So we went on to the IHCs. So IHC showed strong CD20 positive and CD3 and CD5 were negative. So revealing that it's a B cell neoplasm. So whenever it is a B cell neoplasm, we have to subcategorize that. We use the Hans algorithm. So CD10, CBCL2, MUM1 were done. 10 and 6 were negative. MUM1 was strongly positive. It was cyclin D1 negative. So, and the proliferation index was 80%, very high. So the final diagnosis was a monomorphic destructive PTLD, diffuse large B cell lymphoma, non-germinal central B cell type with perforation peritonitis. So following that, she had hematochezia. OGD showed a Forest 3 under ulcer. Colonoscopy showed a altered blood in colon, normal mucosa. CT angiogram, no vascular abnormality. She went into sepsis, septic shock, and we lost the patient. So coming on to a collection of gastrointestinal PTLD in the last 3 years, we had gastric PTLDs in 4 patients, and one was in a lymph node adjacent to the ileum with ileal thickening. The other one also was in the ileum. So most of them were non-GCB type, and 4 cases were post-renal transplant, which occurred within 3 years. It's almost like in 1 year, and they were actually positive for the EBV. And the other case, which occurred more than 3 years, both patients actually expired. One was GCB, non-GCB type, and one was germinal central type. And after this was the 6th case, what I have shown you. And recently we have one more case which presented as a ileocolic induced susception with a polypoidal projection. That patient also had hypoechoic lesions in the liver. So that IHC is being done. That also is like looking like a PTLD. So that's the classification. This must have been covered yesterday. And treatment wise, the first thing is reduction of immunosuppression. Many of them respond. And then anti-B cell antibodies like rituximab, which is given weekly. for 4 weeks and waiting for 2 weeks for the response. Then if it is responding, furthermore 4 weekly doses. Then if it is not responding, chemotherapy, then cytokine based therapy. That is the usual treatment which is followed. And in conclusion, so gastrointestinal PTLD should be considered in any post-transplant immunocompromised patients presenting with vague GI symptoms. Endoscopic surveillance is mandatory in post-transplant settings. A pathogenesis and prognostic significance of EBV negative PTLD is still being studied, but incidence is on rise. Better understanding of the biological and molecular pathogenesis of PTLD in the recent years has refined the therapeutic approaches and improved outcomes for this heterogeneous disease. So ensure PTLD is not missed in early post-transplant period, especially less than 3 years, and appropriate immunomodulation at early onset of disease for better patient outcome. These are my reference.
Thank you, Dr. Sita. That was a really nice presentation. I request the chairpersons to take up the questions, or we can take up the questions at the end of the session. If everyone agrees, that will be better. Dr. Swarnalata, is it fine we take up the questions at the end?
I think so. I mean, I think since there are 6 cases, can we just do the questions immediately after, because it's still fresh in people's memories?
Right,
Otherwise,
sure.
what happens is we forget the first few cases. I mean, that's what I feel.
Okay, absolutely. You can.
Yeah. So I just one small question to Sita.
Yeah.
She had 2 earlier episodes of some abdominal pain, diarrhea, something. Is it possible that it was early PTLD at that time?
Possible, ma'am. It's possible, but the endoscopy and all was not showing anything. So we didn't get any biopsy from that patient. And it was in the ileum also.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So the upper and GI endoscopy must not have shown that also.
Yeah. So that's the thing.
So at the time of actually, just before the biopsy, the diagnosis they considered were CMV versus tuberculosis versus an infiltrative disorder. So it turned out to be a monomorphic PTLD.
Yeah. So there's a comment saying that late PTLD, like in this case, often EBV negative.
Yeah.
But EBV status still needs to be done.
Yeah, it has to be done, but the condition after the biopsy came was like she was deteriorating, and we couldn't get that EBV levels. Actually, in the earlier 3 cases we had it, like they were EBV positive.
EB-ish positive.
Ish positive.
Okay. I think that's it from here. I have no more questions here.
Thank you, Sita Lakshmi ma'am. It was wonderful as you tell us in simple language, and it was self-explanatory. You said several and those things we'll keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Sita, can I just ask you? So, was any chemotherapy given to this patient before the patient succumbed?
No. It was only hardly 7 or 8 days after that she succumbed to illness actually.
Okay.
She went in for a sepsis and hematochezia and all.
So I think we can go on to the next, and
Right.
we can still ask Sita any question if they think of one.
Yeah, sure. So I'll request the presenters to be there. If there are any questions, they can take up. So we go on to the second case that will be presented by Dr. Anila Abraham. She is a pathologist and a dear friend to all of us. And I'll request Dr. Anila Abraham to kindly present the second case.
I sincerely thank Dr. Pallav, Dr. Vinita, and the entire team for this opportunity. Mine is a very straightforward case. It's not okay. So it was not moving. Okay. The patient, he's a 30-year-old male who underwent a live-related transplant in 2013. His mother was his donor. And it all started way back in 2006 when he was 16 years old, when he developed Anasaka. He is from another state who has now come to Chennai for his transplant. Supposedly, a renal biopsy was done there 14 years back. He does not have any records available regarding the diagnosis, but some little papers that he had showed that he was on some steroids and antihypertensives. So for 6 years, he was on medication, and then he deteriorated and they put him on hemodialysis in 2013. In 2014, his mother came forward as a donor and he had a transplant. His post-op period was uneventful. He's on triple immunosuppression and his tacrolimus levels were within normal limits, and he was on regular follow-up except during the last 1 year. Due to logistic reasons, he missed a number of follow-ups. So finally, when he landed up in May 2021 after the second lockdown, his creatinine at that time was 2.7. He had 3+ proteinuria with a UPCR 8. His complements were within normal and his viral markers were negative. A renal biopsy was performed. And this is what it showed. One glomerulus here, you can see that there is definitely an increase in the cellularity and the mesangial matrix. It's expanded a bit. Even on H&E, we can make out that there are areas of interstitial fibrosis where the tubules are small and not back-to-back, interspersed with normal appearing tubules, and a small microcalcification is also here. Some amount of inflammation, but it is restricted to the fibrotic areas. These were the glomeruli, and because I'm just focusing on them now. Mesangial expansion, some amount of sclerosis, and mesangial hypercellularity. This expansion was PAS positive. It was silver negative, so we immediately did a Congo red, which was negative. That's a control. And the trichrome showed intermittent fibrosis alternating with normal renal parenchyma. There was no glomerulitis, no peritubular capillaritis. There was no tubulitis. IFTA was around 35 to 40%. He had severe arteriosclerosis. C40 by immunofluorescence was negative. Now, going by the light microscopic picture and the proteinuria, the immunofluorescence had this characteristic pattern. It had this smudgy IgG. In a scale of 0 to 3, it was 3+, with a 2+ C3, and both kappa and lambda staining. There was no light chain restriction. So the IF itself was very suggestive. We went ahead and did the DNA JB9, which showed a beautiful positivity on the mesangium. So a diagnosis of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, along with possibly chronic CNI tacrolimus toxicity because of his striped fibrosis and the microcalcifications that we saw, was made. So quickly about it, we all know that now this is the marker. You do not require EM now to make a diagnosis of fibrillary GN, which makes it very convenient and very quick for us, with a specificity of more than 99% and a sensitivity of nearly 90%. Fibrillary GN, it is a rare disease, and Western literature says it accounts for only 1% of the native kidney biopsies. Usually they're present in middle-aged and older adults with a mean age of 61. Ours was our boy had it at the age of 16 years old, and they always have proteinuria, some amount of hematuria, and they invariably have hypertension. It is frequently associated with malignancies, dysproteinemias, hepatitis C virus, and autoimmune diseases. Our patient had none of these. He was worked up for it, and it was all negative. The outcome is usually poor, with half of them going to end-stage kidney disease within a short period of diagnosis. Now, coming to what about recurrence of fibrillary GN in the allograft? We do not assume, we do not know for sure that what the native kidney disease was, but going by the age, we do not think that his primary disease was a fibrillary GN, but anyway, there is no way to prove or disprove that. But this is just a quick review of literature of fibrillary GN recurrence. This is from the Mayo Clinic. They had 66 cases. Among them, 14 received transplant, and among the 14, 5 of them, that's 36%, had a biopsy-proven recurrence. And among this 5 patients, 2 had a second transplant, of which 1 again had a second recurrence of fibrillary GN in the second graft also. Another multicentric study where they showed 14 patients with native kidney or fibrillary GN underwent a transplant. 3 of them developed, 1 within 5 years and 2 within 10 years. The remaining 11, in spite of a long follow-up, many of them are still disease-free. So what about de novo fibrillary GN, which the nephrologists for this patient strongly believe that this boy actually has a de novo fibrillary GN in the allograft. So in general about de novo disease, we know it's a disease which is unrelated to the original disease. And we all know, and we've all experienced it, that it's almost impossible to identify the prevalence. And our common experience says, and also the Western literature says, that the most common de novo diseases to develop are FSGS, IgA, membranous, and an MPGN immune complex type. Now, this is the latest study by Dr. Surya Sheshan, which just came out now, and on de novo renal diseases and the role of EM. And she has mentioned fibrillary glomerulonephritis as among one of the de novo glomerular diseases that causes renal transplant dysfunction. So we did an extensive literature search, and all we were able to find out were 2 case reports of de novo fibrillary GN arising in the patients, one with SLE and the other with hepatitis. So why is it so difficult to identify? Is it really that it is so rare, or is it that we are missing out? So as in our patient, only around 15 to 20% have a native biopsy. For us, though he had a native biopsy, it was as good as not having one, because we had absolutely no records of it. And if it's just one core that you take, that is, if C4D is being done by IHC, you will be getting only one core in formalin. And in that case, we do not routinely do IF and EM. So that is another reason why we may be missing out on a number of de novo cases. And pre-implantation biopsy is only done very rarely. Now, could this have been from the donor? That is a possibility, but fortunately for this boy, his mother was a donor and his mother is still with him. After this biopsy was reported as fibrillary GN, his mother was called and she was evaluated. Her creatinine is absolutely normal and she has no proteinuria, no hypertension. So it is unlikely that this boy got it from the donor kidney. It is actually a de novo glomerular disease. And also, many a time, these diseases do not present like how they would in a native kidney, for the fact that the immunosuppression of the drugs that they are given are modifying quite a bit of the severity as well as the disease presentation. And finally, to finally establish the role as to what caused this glomerular disease. Is it a part of the rejection? Is it part of some immune mechanism? Or is it some superadded infection which is causing these glomerular diseases? Is still not known. And this is another paper by Dr. Glasser, who has said that the prognosis of these disease depends not only on the type of the disease, but also the presence of other concomitant injuries that is associated with a graft. It could be rejection, it could be drug toxicity, or it could be a combination of all of them. And in our boy, he also had drug toxicity. And in most cases, this is really bad, that the management is empirical and elusive. So finally, what happened to our patient is there's no established therapeutic regime for fibrillary GN, though literature says that rituximab may stabilize the disease progression. So he was put on 3 months of rituximab, but his creatinine from 2.7 at the time of biopsy went up to 4. And from August this year onwards, he is now back on hemodialysis. So that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anila. That was a really interesting case.
Thank you.
And quite rare indeed. Wasn't there any possibility, because this child had a biopsy somewhere outside, somewhere at another center, pre-transplant? So is there any possibility of getting that biopsy and reviewing? That will be really interesting to know.
Yes, we have been trying, but now they have moved out he's from West Bengal actually. He is now literally sort of staying back in Chennai, and because of logistic reasons, he hasn't gone back. So we are hoping that we will eventually get that block. That is, hopefully, if they still have it, and then we'll be able to get it. So we are waiting for that.
And was electron microscopy performed?
No, because DNA JB9 is diagnostic. We did not go ahead and do an EM, and we had only the paraffin block. We did not keep a separate core for EM, and this was a straightforward, intensely, beautifully DNA JB9 positive, so we didn't do any.
I have a question, Dr. Anila.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's a really nice presentation, and the way you described everything about whether it could be de novo or whether it was a recurrent disease, that discussion was also very nice. But I was still wondering that wouldn't it be nice to try and extract tissue from the formalin block and try and do the EM? You might get some other deposits also which could help you out.
Yeah, but what would you be expecting other than fibrillary GN in this?
Not, I mean, maybe some other deposition disease alongside or associated primary, some other primary glomerulopathy.
Yeah, we could. We still haven't done it. We are actually waiting for the native kidney block to come. We wanted to study that and then do both together. But definitely that's in the plan. But we are holding on for the native kidney biopsy to do both together to find out what that is, and then depending on what that disease is, to combine both and do it.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's one comment on follow-up, which you have mentioned, and a comment on SPEP as well. I'm not sure why they wanted an SPEP, but was it done in this case?
It was done because I don't know whether an SPEP was specifically done, but the nephrologist said he has worked up extensively for malignancies and dysproteinemia. So I assume that they have done it. I don't have the details, but otherwise there's nothing to suggest that on him. They've done an ANA also for any autoimmune disease, is viral serology, any possible cause for fibrillary GN, which is usually associated with dysproteinemias. But then the age also doesn't fit in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, that was a very nice presentation, well worked up. And yeah, I think the electron microscopists will certainly want an electron microscopy, but definitely it adds value. Yeah. But thank God for DNA, JB9 and other markers which are coming up. We can make these diagnoses without any.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get both and then we can have a fully worked up case.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Anila. I should compliment you of thinking of fibrillary glomerulonephritis in a transplant patient, that also a kid. So thank you so much for that beautiful case. And we now move on to the third case for today's session. Dr. Alok Sharma from Lal Path Lab will be presenting the third case on renal transplant pathology. Dr. Alok Sharma.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Vinita, and the entire ISOT team, including Dr. Pallav. So I'll just straight away go to the case. So this is double trouble kind of a scenario. So we'll just quickly go with the clinical thing. So this was a 30-year-old male, and he had an ABO incompatible renal transplant in Feb 2020. And his native kidney disease was unknown, probably CGN, and his brother had donated the kidney to him. He had a relatively unremarkable intra and immediate post-operative course and discharged on a baseline creatinine of around 1.1. And on his follow-up, at 3 months, he was detected with BK viremia. So there was no graft dysfunction, and the anti-AB titers were also negative at that time. So the clinician adjusted the tacrolimus dose and sent him off. But unfortunately, this guy did not report for follow-up 6 months. And now in October 2020, about approximately 8 months after transplant, he presented with graft dysfunction. So at this time, his creatinine was 2.3, and BKV copies were 2.5 lakhs. And the tacrolimus levels surprisingly were almost normal. So it was around 8 nanogram per ml. He had no protein in the urine at that time, and they did a urine decoy cells, which apparently came out positive. And on ultrasound, there was normal RI, and there was mild hydronephrosis. So the clinicians thought of a BK virus nephropathy with such a high BKV load and a previously reported viremia, and they did a renal biopsy. So this is the renal biopsy, a low power view. You can see two cores. The one on the left is definitely showing a lot of inflammatory infiltrate. In a high power view, you can see a lot of infiltrate, maybe some viral cytopathic effects, maybe, and a lot of tubulitis and tubular destruction in this area. Still higher power view. Now the cytopathic effects are much better seen. You can see the ground glassing and the eosinophilic inclusion-like structures. Another area. And on SV40, there was a significant amount of staining. So you had a high viral load and a lot of SV40 replicating virus within the kidney. So definitely there was a BK virus nephropathy going on. On other parts of the biopsy which were away from this inflammatory focus, many of them were okay, like this one apart from some tubular injury, but some others could show some peritubular capillary margination. So these are slightly away from the inflammation, so that is what caught the eye. And one or two glomeruli in the entire biopsy showed these segmental glomeruli. So these things caught our eye and thought there is something else also going on along with the BK virus nephropathy. So to summarize the finding in this case, and C4D was not helpful because it was an ABO incompatible transplant, so there was diffuse C4D possibility anyways. So the dense lymphocytic infiltration, areas of tubulitis, viral cytopathic effects, positive SV40 with a PVL of 2, mild IFTA, and addition, as we just saw, there was focal glomerulitis and peritubular capillaritis. And we advised AB titers, and anti-A was actually very high because 1:64. So keeping everything together, we went ahead and made a diagnosis of active antibody-mediated rejection with the coexisting BK polyomavirus nephropathy, stage 1. Now on follow-up, this patient was treated up with Plex and IVIG, and of course the dose was adjusted, and he actually responded. So the creatinine actually came down to 1.4, and at 1 month post-discharge, the BKV copies were still there, but significantly came down to around 2,000 per ml. And then again, he was lost to follow-up. So that's what happens in COVID times. Patients don't follow up regularly. Now in again 2021 September, he presented with proteinuria and graft dysfunction. Now he denied any drug non-compliance at this time, but on his urine you could see a lot of protein. There was 3+ protein, and creatinine now was approximately 3.8, almost 4, and TAC levels were still okay. And at this time he had no BK virus, was negative. So since there was a lot of confusing picture, a repeat allograft biopsy was performed. So this is the second biopsy. You can see some fibrosis, atrophy has started developing here. Empty stained section, significant fibrosis, and this glomerulus you can see has showing some perihilar FSGS and hyalinosis. And one glomerulus, you see there's a lot of glomerulitis in this particular glomerulus. If you look around carefully around the PTCs also, you can see some margination there. Past stained section showing thickened capillaries, some reduplication. So just for a comparison, so this was the glomerulus we saw in the first biopsy. This is what we're seeing in the second biopsy. So thickening, reduplication, everything has set in. And this is the silver stain showing nice GBM reduplication. C4D positive in glomeruli, some amount, some linear, it has to be there, ABO incompatible transplant. You can see some staining, and interestingly, you can see some C4D granular staining around the TBMs also, probably a leftover of the previous BK virus infection. But the SV40 per se was negative. So this antibody is directed at replicating virus. So no viral replicating viruses, at least in this biopsy. And EM was done, which showed nice multilamination of peritubular capillary. So this was a transplant glomerulopathy, chronic active AVMR. So summarizing these biopsies, glomerulitis, PTC margination, peritubular capillaritis, GBM and peritubular capillary multilamination, and IFTA of around 30 to 35%. So overall, this was a chronic active ABMR with transplant glomerulopathy. And at this time also his anti-A IgG titers were 1:64. So a complete diagnostic summary in this case. So he had a coexisting BK virus nephropathy and an active ABMR in first biopsy, which has over a period of time progressed to a chronic active ABMR with development of TG. So we know all this. We'll just directly come to the interesting points here. So we know that BK virus is a interesting virus and causes a lot of problems in the allograft. And renal biopsy still remains the gold standard. And biopsy proven definitive PVN has approximately an incidence of 5 to 6%. So it varies from various geographic regions. And the most common factor associated with development of PVN is the intense immunosuppression, and which is the mainstay of treatment, as we still don't have good enough antiviral drugs to contain this infection. And as in this particular center where this patient was biopsy, patients are monitoring BKV post-transplant at 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. So this patient was actually picked up with BK viremia when he visited for a 3-month routine. He was asymptomatic at that time. Now this is the perpetual question which a clinician faces: rejection versus infection access. So on one side you have insufficient immunosuppression, other side you have excessive immunosuppression. So it's a vicious circle basically. So over immunosuppression leading to infection, viral activation, again forcing reduction of immunosuppression, precipitating a rejection, again forcing immunosuppression, and then over-immunosuppression. So this is a vicious circle which the clinicians face in their practice, and it's an interesting thing and a difficult topic to navigate. So what were the challenges in this case? So main challenge is, one, from the clinician point of view, there are no clear guidelines or enough experience to manage the cases which have a coexisting rejection in a viral infection, specifically BKV nephropathy. Although in 2009 guidelines did suggest that when the BK viral load is persistently above 10,000 copies, there is evidence of reducing immunosuppression, but it varies from clinician to clinician. And on the diagnostic front, actually the acute cellular rejection is almost impossible to distinguish from a BK virus induced inflammation. We all know that. So unless we get intimal arthritis, it is almost impossible to distinguish that inflammation which is viral induced from a cellular rejection. And diagnosis of coexisting AMR is often rendered difficult by the inflammation and obscuration of peripheral capillaries. So basically, we have to very carefully look at glomerulitis, and if we are lucky, we may get intimal arthritis to actually distinguish them. And C4D staining, of course, when it is positive in an ABO compatible graft, is helpful. So what were the interesting features here? BK viremia, of course, coexisting features, good response to therapy initially. There was remission of viremia, but again, persistence of humoral response leading to a relatively rapid rise of deterioration of the graft and eventual development of transplant. So the last slide here. So what are the possibilities, questions, and challenges? If you have noted here, the BK viremia actually preceded the development of, or the detection at least, of the donor-specific antibody. So is it possible that the DSA formation was actually induced by the BK virus? And interestingly, there is an interesting study from Mayo Clinic which actually suggests this. So there are certain cases where DSA is actually induced by the BK virus. So you have a BK viremia, BK virus nephropathy, and then you develop a antibody-mediated rejection. So this is an important thing which we should keep in mind at the back of our mind. And the second point is, of course, do the grafts with combined rejection and BK virus infection fare worse than either alone? So there is evidence that BK virus infected grafts do worse than the ones who have rejection alone. But when these two occur together, proposedly or logically, they should do worse, as it happened in this particular.
Thank you, Dr. Alok. That was a really nice, intriguing case. This is often we face these issues day in and day out during our practice. I just wanted to find out that after the first biopsy, when it was reported as BKV nephropathy with the ABMR, was the immunosuppression dose reduced, or because IVIG was added? So did they decrease the routine?
It was reduced. They adjusted the tacrolimus dose and changed from MMF to azathioprine. That's what they did. But then the patient didn't follow up because of COVID, so they really didn't have a very clear-cut follow-up for a long time before he presented the transplant. But they definitely did adjust the dose at that time.
Yeah, because in the second biopsy, it almost looks like a flare of
absolutely
rejection.
Yeah, true. Very true. Very
right. Thank you.
I just wanted to find out if a DSA also had been done.
Yes, ma'am. Those actually, it was an ABO incompatible transplant, so they were relying on the anti-A and anti-B.
No, the HLA DSA.
No, they did not do that.
Because there's some literature also that often these patients have a combined, ABMR due to anti-ABO and anti-HLA as well,
Very
you know.
good. But it was not done in this case because for the clinician, it becomes difficult to
do so many tests. I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yes, we don't usually, I think, how often have you seen ABMR in ABO incompatible transplants with?
Very often. So
very often?
It is not unusual for us to see antibody-mediated rejection, especially, unfortunately, with now ABO compatible transplantation has been around for a few years.
You're right.
Incompatible. So now we are seeing a lot of chronic AMRs with ABO incompatible. So that's one part of the whole story. Probably we have missed that earlier part of the disease pattern, but we often see it.
Yeah, because
I will also agree with Dr. Alok. We do see ABMR in these patients, and of course, chronic ABMR.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to ask a question. In ABO incompatible grafts, C4D is diffusely positive. But what about ABO compatible grafts, sir? In Heptinstall says that 2 to 4% of ABO compatible also shows C4D positivity. Can you throw light on such cases?
You were talking about the cases with BK virus nephropathy.
No, sir. Simple ABO incompatible and ABO compatible grafts. So ABO incompatible, the staining for C4D is diffusely positive in ABO incompatible. What about ABO compatible grafts that C4D rejection, C4D positivity without active rejection? One ban criteria they added.
Yeah. So that we sometimes see in very early rejection. So you have a C4D that usually preformed antibodies. You have a C4D positivity, and you don't see many features of rejection. So that's one problem. But it's not common, trust me.
So it is not accommodation, but it is like early.
Yeah. If it is an ABO compatible transplant, we'll have to take it as
a rejection. Okay, sir.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Are you asking about the histologically silent C4D positive in the ABO compatible ones?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's a different. It's difficult to conclude as a rejection process just based on the C4D. There are very occasional reports. Even we have one case. Now the patient is almost now 9 years down the line. She has been maintaining normal graft function. The first biopsy was done around 6 months or so in her post-transplant period, which was silent histologically, but only the C4D was diffusely positive. I
think you had presented this case in Mysore, Mahesh.
Yeah. Correct.
So that is accommodation probably.
Yeah, more or less similar to accommodation in ABO incompatible.
Right, exactly.
And was it a protocol biopsy or was it a for-cause biopsy, Dr. Mahesha?
No, that was a for-cause. The indicated biopsy. And the clinician was, he went on the based on his clinical acumen. So he didn't anti-reject just on the basis of C4D. He titrated the CNI levels, and fortunately the patient and the graft function improved, and she has been maintaining very well. I have been after the nephrologist to do at least a protocol biopsy to see how it is for almost whenever I meet him, but there has no protocol biopsies because there is no indication for the biopsy.
One more point I want to make, if with the permission of the chair, that it is not uncommon to see ATN with diffuse C4D positivity in the setting of ABO incompatible transplants. So it should not be considered as a rejection. Number one. Number two, in majority of the cases in our study we have published recently, the G plus PTC score is more than 2. So we have to give a lot of importance to the microinflammatory score in patients with the ABO incompatible transplants, even if we are not relying on C4D. And in cases of ABO incompatible transplants, majority of the cases of ABMR we are seeing within first 3 weeks. After that, even the acute ABMR is very less common, and the progression to chronic antibody-mediated rejection is even lesser common.
Can I ask one question? What about C3D? When you have a silent C4D, will C3D add to some to decision making?
No, I don't think so that C3D will have an additional value. And moreover, one thing also, it is important that apart from monitoring the anti-ABO titers, which are usually done for a few weeks after transplantation, whenever we have got morphological features, we should always do DSA titers in these patients.
Thank you, Dr. Palla, for the comments. If there are no more questions, can we move on to the next case?
Yeah, I think we'll move on to the next one.
So we have the fourth case in the renal transplant pathology segment, and that will be presented by Dr. Srinivas, who is an additional professor in the Department of Pathology at JIPMER Pondicherry. Dr. Srinivas, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Vinita, for the introduction. And at the outset, I'm very thankful to the organizing team of this ISOT conference, especially Dr. Pallav, So I'll start this case. This is a case of 56 years old male underwent deceased donor renal allograft transplant in 2018. And native kidney disease was CKD secondary to the accelerated hypertension. History of antibody mediated rejection was there in the first month of the post transplant, and that time that histomorphology was mild ATN with mild tubular atrophy, and C4D IHC was 80% of the PTCs were positive. That is in the first month of the post transplant, and that time patient was treated with IVIG and plasmapheresis. And again, there is a persistent renal dysfunction after 1 month again. That means in the second month of the post-transplant. And that time the serum creatinine was increased to 1 to 1.8 milligrams in baseline. And renal biopsy was done in the second month post-transplant. So these are all the images. If you see in the kidney biopsy, it is showing the very busy interstitium, and the tubules also widely placed because of this dense interstitial inflammation. And the glomeruli are morphologically unremarkable. If you see into the high power, this glomerular unremarkable. There is no evidence of any glomerulitis, especially in the second month post transplant, and no duplication. We can't expect usually in the second month post transplant. And if you see into these tubules, many of these tubular epithelial cells nuclei was enlarged. If you see, compare the normal ones compared to these tubular epithelial nuclei were definitely enlarged. And majority of them, it is showing the smudged nuclear chromatin, and some of them it is showing the prominent nucleoli also. And so this is the other area of the tubules. It is showing the ground glass appearance of this viral inclusions, and you can appreciate occasional lymphocytic tubulitis also here, whatever I'm showing with my cursor. And in between, you can appreciate the dense interstitial inflammation, lymphocytes, and very occasional plasma cells. So in the other high power areas, you can appreciate there is a tubular necrosis as well as a basement membrane destruction by this in the HND images. And in other areas, you can appreciate some of the tubules also showing this necrosis. And again, the lining epithelial cells it is showing the enlarged nucleus. So, and interstitium is a very dense inflammation, lymphocytes, and some plasma cells are there, and neutrophils are sparse. So in addition, there is a collection of these macrophages forming the ill-defined granulomas. You can appreciate these are the ill-defined granulomas. However, this caseous necrosis, those are not seen. And again, in this here, you can appreciate these macrophages are palisading around the granulomas, palisading macrophages around this glomeruli. And at places, you can appreciate this segmental necrosis in the two course of the biopsy. And in the PSM stain, you can appreciate the same segmental necrosis within the Bowman's capsule in this area. And here you can appreciate even the basement membrane duplication in some of the tubules, which is highlighted with the silver stain. Some of the tubules are showing the basement membrane duplication, and instead there is a necrotic areas. And here also you can appreciate these areas of the necrosis. So we thought it will definitely viral inclusions. It will be viral nephropathy. So we did first, anyway, the most common ones, as we all know that it is a polyomavirus, but SV40 was negative. And even the CMV was also negative, one by step process. And again, this C4D was negative because this patient was in the first month, C4D was positive AMR. So if you see that anyway, we know that it could be certain definite diagnosis, but if you analyze all the viral inclusions in the post-transplant kidney biopsy, the most common one is BKV virus, and there are 4 types of the inclusions are there in the polyomavirus. The one of the ones most smudgy type inclusions, which can be seen polyomavirus as well as adenovirus also. But the more other in the CMV, usually it is showing the homogeneous with halos and the intranuclear as well as intracytoplasmic inclusions. And apart from that, the CMV, it is showing the mainly the endothelial cells will be mostly showing the inclusions apart from the tubular epithelial cells. So what about the adenovirus? Usually adenovirus, it will shows focal necrosis and the granuloma formations and interstitial hemorrhage. So these are all the ones, once you see these points in the post-transplant kidney biopsy, you should suspect it can be adenovirus, especially in the first 3 months. Okay, so in our case, there is as I showed all my figures, it's focal necrosis and the granuloma formation is also there. So we sent with a strong suspicion, I sent this voted slides to the Chennai Dr. Anila Abram Renopath Center, thanks to Dr. Anila. So it is showing the both nuclear as well as the cytoplasmic positivity of this adenovirus IHC. In the high power, you can see both nuclear as well as the cytoplasmic IHC positive, and in these pictures also. So this patient was, again, I thought it will be better to send the electron microscopy, but patient was really not affordable, so I didn't send the electron microscopy. So this is a case of adenovirus nephritis in a post-transplant biopsy. There is no definite evidence of rejections, and the BAM scores, it will be the inflammation, dense inflammation I2 with occasional tubulitis T1, and apart from that, there is total inflammation is TI2. So there is a brief about the adenovirus infection. This is a non-enveloped double-stranded DNA virus which is causing this adenovirus infection. The possible routes of the infection, it includes reactivation of the endogenous latent infection. The most one is the most common ones. The other proposed theory is the transmission via the donor organs. So apart from the other organs involving by this adenovirus includes, apart from the kidney, bladder, lung, liver, and GI tract. So the incidence, which is rare in the kidney transplant compared to other organs, and onset is typically in the first 3 months of the post-transplant period. In this case, it is the second second month of the post-transplant, and more common in the stem cell recipients in compared to this routine allografts. And the native kidneys were very occasionally involved compared to the post-transplant kidneys. And the children are also most susceptible to below 5 years this viral infection. The presentation, the most common presentation is hematuria and pyuria, followed by the dysuria, fever, and bilateral testicular pain. And apart from the acute, there is an acute kidney injury which is causing the increased serum creatinine. So the laboratory test, which includes whenever we suspect first 3 months with this morphology, you need to go through the real-time PCR. And in the blood, this can be preceding the tissue in the prior. And apart from that, we can do the enzyme immunoassay for antigen in the blood. So the pathogenesis and the severity of the clinical symptoms and the organ involvement. It can be any type of the organs can be involved. So all this pathogenesis, severity of the clinical symptoms depends on this adenovirus, mainly the serotypes, as well as the patient age and the intensity of the underlying immunosuppression and the type of the tissue and organ transplants. So the infection is most commonly caused by the serotypes of 11, 34, 35, and 37. But out of all these things, the 35, 37, and 11, all the articles, it says that it is causing the hemorrhagic cystitis and necrotizing interstitial nephritis. So the classical morphological findings, as whenever we saw into the nephropathologist as a viral inclusion body, so easy, more common in all the 4 types of the viral inclusions. But apart from the inclusion bodies, if you saw the rupture of the basement membrane, which is highlighted with the silver and the PAA stains, and the granuloma, focal granuloma formation, that non-necrotizing and palisading granulomas, as well as the segment of necrosis. So if you saw these 3 morphological features, apart from the viral inclusion bodies, you should suspect this adenovirus. So, but that time the most common differential diagnosis is the acute cellular rejection, because sometimes there will be enlargement of the tubular epithelial cells nucleus that may be causing the suspicion, especially in the post-transplant, maybe after 6 months or 1 year. But at that time, we need to see all the entire biopsy carefully to look for the C4D and endarteritis, other features. The second differential diagnosis, yes, obviously the polyomavirus we need to suspect, because this is the most common viral inclusion seen in the post-transplant kidney biopsies, and rarely, very rarely, there is a double infections, adenovirus and polyomavirus. And the third differential is drug-induced acute interstitial nephritis, but we all know that this is a little tricky by seeing the post-transplant biopsy, but there are some clues are there. It can be eosinophils if it is a drug-induced, and the second feature is that more common in the drug-induced, it's seen mainly in the corticomedullary junction, that inflammation. So what are the ancillary tests what we have in the pathologist hand? So we can proceed with the IHC nuclear and cytoplasmic staining of this adenovirus antibody, which is directed against the adenovirus antigens. So, but it will be nuclear as well as cytoplasmic staining. And the second, electron microscopy, the viral particles, usually these viral particles are 60 to 80 nanometers. So these are all the, which is seen as like IHC in the both nuclei and cytoplasm. And these viral particles are double the size of the polyomavirus and half the size of the CMV virus. So this is what usually the most smaller ones are polyomavirus, followed by the adeno, and followed by the CMV, the size of the virus in the electron microscopy. See, if you see into these particles which I took from the Colvin book, these are the nuclear viral inclusions seen in the nucleus. And one of the picture it is showing these variants are totally replacing the nuclear chromatin into the periphery. And if you see into the very higher power, these variants are seen into the crystalline arrays, varying size of the variants. It will be the 60 to 80. So the treatment, the first most ones is the reduction of the immunosuppressive agents. That is the first most treatment to be followed by the nephrologist, and followed by the antivirals like cidofovir and ribavirin and valganciclovir and the ganciclovir. And there, one of the recent articles was published in the AJKD. They are telling that intravenous immunoglobulin is also useful, and that prognosis of these patients, usually recovery is common if it is localized. If it is localized to the particular transplant like kidney and particular organs, but if it is disseminated to the other organs, it will be very fatal. So this case, once after this diagnosis, antivirals are started, the patient was improved, but there is no follow-up in recently because of this COVID situation. This is the case of the 2018. So to conclude this case, so whenever as a nephrologist, when we saw into the post-transplant biopsy, tubular necrosis, rupture of the basement membrane and focal necrosis, and the granuloma formation, especially the palisading granuloma formation, we need to suspect adenovirus, because when it is localized, that it will be cured very completely, but if it is disseminated, that it will be very fatal. Thank you. I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Srinivas. That was a really interesting case. We enjoyed it completely. I just wanted to find out if RT-PCR was done in this patient.
No, madam. Actually, RT-PCR was not done. I am forced to this patient to the electron microscopy also, but really very poor patient. So we didn't do anything.
The other thing which I sometimes think is, when we read about adenovirus, do we see these viral particles as we see in BKV decoy cells in the urine? So what is the literature related to adenovirus? I'm not aware.
Madam. See, adenovirus is very rare to see even in the urine also. That often means it will not see in the urine also usually.
This is one virus which also involves the tubular epithelial cells like BK, polyoma virus.
Yes.
So I was just wondering whether people see it in the urine or not.
I think that was a very nice case. Actually, I wouldn't have thought that granulomas, though we read in books, I haven't seen an adeno myself. The granulomas will be so distinctive, you know. It's almost like tuberculoid granulomas, very large, and of course the necrosis. Very nicely worked up, and yeah, well done.
Thank you. Thank you,
madam. Do we have any comments or questions from any of the participants? So Dr. Srinivas will be there till the end of the session. We can move forward, and we move on to the non-renal transplant cases. We now invite Dr. Mukul Viz, whom we take pride to be our SGPGI student, who is in Rela Hospital, Chennai, and we're talking about a liver transplant case. Dr. Mukul.
So, you all can see my screen? Yes. My screen is visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Pallav. And thank you, ISOT, for giving me this opportunity to share this case here. And I'll be sharing a liver case, not the kidney case. So it's a case of early allograft dysfunction. So this is a 49-year-old male. It's a known case of polycythemia vera. It's JAK2 mutation positive patient. Patient is a high risk. So chronic Budd-Chiari syndrome patient has. He underwent DIPS, which is direct intrahepatic portocable shunt. But his liver function were deteriorating, and in view of that, he was taken up of DDLT. This is way back in June. On the day of organ allocation, his COVID CBNAT was done. It was negative. He's vaccinated both doses by both doses. Anti-spike antibody titer were highly positive. HRCT normal at the time of DDLT and completely asymptomatic. No pulmonary, any other issues. So he underwent operation, uneventful, extubated on table, good graft functions on day 7. Till day 7, functions were good. On day 7, his liver function deteriorated. The bilirubin was 6 milligram per deciliter, AST 420, ALT 400, gamma GGT 664. They did the Doppler. There was no vascular issue. In radiology, there was no evidence of any biliary dilation or any evidence of biliary obstruction. So the patient is a known case of polycythemia vera. He was on Clexone full dose, and so decision was taken that there was no history of any sepsis, any culture was positive, everything was looking okay. So they thought this must be rejection only, and without doing biopsy, they started the treatment of rejection. They gave steroid for 2 days. Along with, they also hiked up. He was in triple immunosuppression, also hiked up MMF and tacrolimus were hiked. Then they repeated the enzyme after 2 days. After this treatment, AST 320, ALT 300, GGT is rising. From 600, it became 900. So they planned the first biopsy. This case is not from my center, it's a referral case. So here what we see, here we can see these are the liver biopsies. And in these liver biopsies, we can see the portal area. There is mild inflammation here. There is some cholestasis here. There is some inflammation in the lobules. Here also in this portal area, you can see mild, very mild inflammation. Ducts are okay. There's an arteriole here. Vein is okay. Nothing much happening here. Some inflammation. So if you see this biopsy at this part, you'll see, okay, probably resolved rejection, something is happening. If you see in this area, this portal tract, there is again this arteriole duct, there is some injury, duct injury, some polymorphs you can see, some lymphocytes, some polymorphs you can see, portal vein, again, absolutely unremarkable, nothing happening in the adjacent lobule. In this area, you can see some ductal injury. You can see ductulitis. There is injury of the duct. There is inflammation in the duct wall. Lymphocyte, we can see there is disturbance of the polarity. And there is inflammation, which is also showing lymphocytes, histiocytes, some eosinophils and polymorphs also. And which is mild to moderate inflammation only. Again, adjacent to it, nothing more. Again, this portal area, inflammation, duct, there is some injury to the duct. You can see there is polarity disturbances, inflammation, again, some mixed inflammation, portal vein, absolutely normal. This again, occasion you can see some intraluminal polymorphs here, some inflammation here in this area. In this area, you can see necrosis. There is areas of confluent necrosis here. You can see some eosinophils, some edema, necrosis. Occasional plasma cells are also there. What you see there, this is a portal tract. You see some thrombi formation here. You see this portal vasculature. There is fibrin thrombi here. You can see here this portal vein is okay. Arteriole is okay. Duct is also unremarkable. Some lymphocyte inside it, but as such there is no injury. In this portal vein, again, you can see some partial evidence of thrombus formation. You can see red blood cells. You can see fibrin. So there is some evidence of thrombus formation here. You can see some inflammation here, necrosis here, and also periportal necrosis is happening here. Duct, again, normal. This duct is okay. This arteriole may be showing some injury, some apoptotic necrotic injury here. Again, areas showing some lobule, showing cholestasis. There's some inflammation, necrosis. And again, some necrosis, inflammation, perivenular and cholestasis. Again, in this area also necrosis, again, spotty necrosis, this is venule, some necrosis, histiocyte collection and cholestasis. So what do you think? There is hepatitis, there is necrosis, there is cholestasis, there are occasional venous thrombi in the portal vein. So what I thought, is this COVID? Is this COVID-19? This patient was negative, patient is vaccinated. So is this COVID-19 happening? If these are COVID times, so we have to think of that. So I requested them to review for radiology because there is evidence of thrombi formation to look for any evidence of thrombosis elsewhere, coagulation workup and viral workup, all viral workup, including COVID-19 PCR. Now, repeat COVID PCR was done. It was positive. And the CT value was 33. At the time of DDLT, what they did CBNAT, the COVID PCR was negative, but there was some CT value which is 44. So maybe there was certain low level of viremia at that time. Also, is other viral bulk, everything else, hepatitis and CMV, EBV, HSV, everything was negative. As soon as they reduced the immunosuppression, AST came down to 120, ALT 200, but GGT again rising up. We see evidence of cholangitis in the biopsy, and GGT is again rising. But and the thing, there was no pulmonary or any cardiac issue, saturation normal. There were no other issues with the patients. So they planned for repeat biopsy. Is there something else happening in the biopsy, or is there now rejection is happening, or there is some or infection or sepsis is happening? This is the repeat liver biopsy of the patient. In this biopsy, again, this is the portal area. Now we can see mild inflammation here. Now we are seeing some herniation of the portal veins also. This portal vein, this is in direct contact. There is no stroma here, is in direct concentration, in its direct connection of the parenchyma. Here, you can see some inflammation here in this portal area. Again, mild inflammation here. Here in this, some inflammation here, some fibrin here in this probably portal vein, some RBCs, but mild inflammation only, nothing else. In the lobule, apart from that, now we are also seeing apoptosis. We can see apoptosis here, we can see apoptosis here. So there is some apoptosis also happening. Some congestion is also happening in the sinusoids. Now, in focal area, we can also see fibrin thrombi here in the sinusoid. There is fibrin, there is red blood cells, there is necrosis here, and cholestasis is happening. And around the central veins, we see complete thrombosis. There's thrombosis of the central vein with ischemic necrosis. We can see complete confluent necrosis in this area. This is the vein completely narrowed. You can see this vein completely thrombosed hepatic vein. Here in other areas also, we can see areas of necrosis. There is evidence of thrombosis and necrosis here. Here also, you can see it's central vein thrombosed, here, marked narrowing of the lumen, some inflammation here and necrosis here also. Again, to show you a vein, how it is getting thrombosed here, some with fibrin. And this is the trichome stain. You can confirm the thrombosis here. This vein is completely thrombosed here and with extensive necrosis and some inflammation around that area. Again, thrombosis and necrosis. So in an other area, you can, in this portal tract, you can also start seeing portal herniation here. Here is a portal vein, which is also again herniation directly in contact with the lobule here also. And here there is also some herniation in direct connection with the lobule and cholestasis. We did C4D. C4D again stained the necrotic. There was no other staining in any other venous channel or portal area or central area or sinusites. But necrotic hepatocytes, we know that they are positive for C4D. So confirming the necrosis here. We did CK7. The ducts were there. There was no duct loss. Ducts were confirmed, and there was no periportal any metaplasia in the hepatocytes with CK7 positivity. We have SARS-CoV-2 antibody available with us. So we did the antibody in this patient, and we saw this in thrombosed area, we saw some kind of granular staining in some endothelial cells and histiocytes here. In this thrombosed area also, we saw some granular staining here. We can see these Kupffer cells here in this preserved area. They are showing some granular staining, and in these histiocytes and some endothelial cells showing some staining of the SARS-CoV-2 anti-spike. This is the antibody. This is the control. This is the lung control which we have of the explant lung with SARS-CoV-2, which was transplanted, and you can see that this is positive for the SARS-CoV-2 antibody. So the control has worked, and there was some granular staining in the liver. So with temporal association, with dysfunction, SARS-CoV positive, I suspected probably this is that unusual case which we were thinking of at SARS-CoV-2 hepatitis with thrombosis and confluent necrosis. That was my diagnosis. So we asked them, we need to treat now because GDT increasing, and that GDT is probably because of the cholangitis happening in the patient. So they did treat it with the monoclonal antibody cocktail was given. The immunosuppression was modest. They maintained the modest immunosuppression, and now AST reduced. After that, AST reduced to 80, ALT 110, GDT, the report we got reduced to 600, and within 2 weeks, the patient completely recovered, and he is now on outpatient basis, completely okay. His liver function tests are absolutely unremarkable. So coming to this patient was unique as patient of liver transplant recipient to have COVID. He is a patient JAK2 mutation positive polycythemia vera with COVID-19. We know that these myeloproliferative, there are very less literature on this, but myeloproliferative, these people who are non-CML myelo are very prone for thrombosis, and with SARS-CoV-2, they are more prone for thrombosis because SARS-CoV-2 still himself causes endothelial dysfunction. So he was on full dose of anticoagulation. He was a high-risk patient, full low molecular on low molecular weight heparin. He developed COVID with CT of 33 above 30, very low viral values. Viral titers still develop thrombosis and necrosis and have to be treated with the Roche antibody cocktail. So coming to SARS-CoV-2 liver, this is a member of coronavirus. I think and it's a LAL positive sense serum single-stranded RNA virus, and we know that it's fight with there is a receptor binding domain of the S protein. It combined with ACE receptors. ACE receptors, we know they are present on cholangiocytes and as well as some low level in hepatocytes and portal and hepatic vein vasculature. There is plus minus literature on sinusoidal endothelial. Some says they are present, some says they are not sure that that ACE2 receptor is present on sinusoidal endothelial cells. There is no known expression in Kupffer cells, what we know till this time. And the patient, if CLD, the hepatocytes, there is more expression because of the inducement of the enzyme. So it happened. But our patient was a post-transplant. There's no CLD. It was an absolutely unremarkable liver in the patient. And if you know hepatotropism, also we have all talked about lung, but hepatotropism of the SARS-CoV-2 is also known. And we know that in the cell lines, in the viral cell lines, as well as in the organoids which are generated, they have shown if they have ACE2 and with the serine protease enzyme TMRSS2 something and 4, they all have shown that the life cycle of the virus. And in the liver also, we know because there is ACE2 receptor present and also expression of the serine protease, there is tropism in the human liver also. pathomechanism, it's very multifactorial in COVID, and basically contributions from immune-mediated SARS, we know one of the most common cause which happens because of severe SARS-CoV-2, drug-induced liver injury, possible cytopathic change. Now we know that even viral particles have been demonstrated, mitochondrial dysfunction. There are a lot of the literature on this now coming up. Endothelial dysfunction, we know the exposure of the tissue factor, endothelitis, thrombosis, ischemia because of the respiratory issues, and congestion, which can because of right heart failure. But our patient, there was no cardiac issues. There was only involvement of the lung, of the liver clinically, as well as in the biopsies. There were in other radiology, there were no other issues with the patient. So, and reported injury in liver is actually quite high in COVID, up to 50, or in some reports actually it is up to 70. In the meta-analysis, you will see up to 70% of enzyme elevation. Mostly it is mild, very rarely severe, and if severe, leads to more death. So SARS-CoV-2 pathology, all the things have been described. Mostly which have been described is in autopsy literature. They are very, very rare biopsies in which they have done a biopsy, because they are severe patients who have issues. In mild, you will never do a biopsy, and severe, very difficult to do biopsy because of the coagulation, all the issues. So all those things have been described: fatty change, lobulation, apoptosis, necrosis, hemorrhage, megakaryocytes, vascular alteration, fibrin thrombi, cholestasis, as well as histologic hyperplasia. And there is some things which we have also seen. Some data is from the US and European, and we have seen some of the cases now which are showing diffuse ductopenia and evidence of post-COVID cholangiopathy. And these are mild cases which have recovered, and then they are developing ductopenia. One of them we also did auxiliary transplant, and he recovered. So this one is some of the other biopsies which I have seen, referral cases and rare cases of ours, in which this is another biopsy in which showing necrosis in the case of SARS-CoV-2, PCR positive. And this is a case which was transplanted, done with ductopenia and a lot of cholestasis. He's completely okay, now discharged and home. This was auxiliary liver transplant. In one of the biopsies which was sent to me, shows some sclerosis of the vein, shows some fatty change and sclerosis. This was patient diabetic, so fatty change, I don't know because of the viral or not, but there was some sclerosis. Maybe that is because of the SARS-CoV-2, which have been described by Sorozani from Italy. So liver transplant, again, liver transplant is a vulnerable population. There is very heterogeneous data. Somebody says that they are more prone for all those issues with COVID. Some say there is no increased death in these patients. So data is extremely heterogeneous. And but what the recent meta-analysis, September when I read, they said 70% of the LT, if you have SARS-CoV-2, they will be hospitalized and they will have GI symptoms. Liver findings as such are biopsies are extremely rare in these patients. When I reviewed the literature, I could only find 3 cases of allograft in which biopsy was done in patients. One was pediatric by this one in 2020, which shows some hepatitis and some rejection-like features, ductulitis, all those you can see necrosis. And this one again from Stephen Lagana, which shows again some hepatitis and there was lymphocytic inflammation and associated with mild to moderate rejection. And this one again necrosis here, some apoptosis and mitosis also. There are a lot of mitosis you see sometimes. And this is by Isabel Field, in which they describe 2 cases.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. We are running out of time. May I request you?
Yeah. So this is the last. Yeah. So last. This is that. So this is again shows some rejection and necrosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukul. That was a really nice case. I would just like to ask you a very small question. What is the control that you use for COVID?
This is the explant lung.
Okay. So
transplanted lung for COVID issues, severe COVID.
And the other question is, why did you suspect COVID when you knew when the patient was undergoing? What was the reason that you suspected that it could be COVID?
I think because it's COVID time and I'm looking COVID everywhere, all the liver biopsies. But I think the main thing was actually thrombus, which I could see in one of the portal veins. That fibrin thrombus really, and the patient of polycythemia thrombus, they will not develop thrombosis so early, even if he was a high risk case. And he was and they didn't believe me actually. The first biopsy, they did not believe me that can be COVID. I asked them, you have to do a you have to do a PCR, which came positive at that time, and then with biopsy, then thrombosis, and then everything now is history. And patient recovered.
Very nice.
I would briefly like to share experience from Gangaram. 2 of our patients, well stable, 2 years post-transplant, stable patients. They came after 2 doses of Covishield. The presentation, the liver biopsy findings were actually very similar to what you showed us. In addition to that, there were areas of hemorrhagic necrosis and thrombosis. The only additional thing which we were advised by our hematologist were to do a platelet factor 4. hit antibodies, which were positive in these cases, because not only in these cases, in other cases also present, those individuals presenting with thromboembolic phenomena
Yes.
have PF4 antibodies. So I think that is one additional input I would like to, but similar cases, and
we have seen and we have published also in Journal of Autoimmunity about post-vaccination. We have seen autoimmune hepatitis post-Covishield.
Yes.
We have seen autoimmune hepatitis post Covaxin. Actually, we have seen liver failure post Covaxin, as well as we have seen some cholestasis post vaccination. So it is a known phenomenon. It is coming up, and it is a known phenomenon.
Yeah. Thank you. Very nice case, in fact.
So I think there was a question by Dr. Srinivas in the chat box. Should I take it up? So Dr. Srinivas was asking about whether the IHC was done in the first. I think that what he meant was whether IHC was done in the first or the second biopsy, the liver biopsy.
Yeah, we did in both actually. First nothing came in the first. Only in second biopsy it came. This granular staining in the some endothelial cells and histiocytes. It was done in the first also. It was negative.
So Dr. Satish has asked about any vanishing bile ducts.
Vanishing? No, there was no vanishing bile duct.
Dr. Vij, one question I have. Between the first and the second biopsies, when was the vaccination given?
No, he is post-vaccinated, ma'am, before transplant.
Even the first biopsy was post-vaccination.
Ma'am, he is vaccinated. He has got nothing to do with vaccination. He is post-vaccinated patient. Before the transplant, he was vaccinated.
Right. Okay.
Both the doses.
Okay. Because you said that the first biopsy did
it's
not.
A breakthrough infection, ma'am. It's a breakthrough infection in a patient who is vaccinated and developed liver failure with no severe pulmonary or cardiac issues.
But it was a really beautiful case, and you presented it very well with very nice photographs also. It's really nice.
So, because as the organizer said, we are running out of time, so we move on to the next case. That is the last case for today. It will be taken up by Dr. Satish Rao, who is in KIMS Hyderabad, the pathologist in KIMS Hyderabad, and we look forward to the case. Dr. Satish, please.
So thank you, Dr. Pallav, Dr. Vinita, and ISOT team to give me this opportunity. Maybe this is my first presentation in ISOT. So now this is to be very short. The history is 38-year male with dilated cardiomyopathy since 2017. He was undergoing medical treatment. He was a patient of type 2 diabetes mellitus for last 12 years on oral hypoglycemics, but now presently on insulin. So he had a history of pulmonary TB somewhere in 2018, and he completed around 6 months of ADT. And just before transplant, he was MAN2 and TB quantiferon gold negative. So I don't have the pictures of the whole explant per se, but this is what we had observed on the grossing time. This is around 414 grams and measuring 15 into 13. And grossly, there were no significant changes. So when I was seeing these sections, I could make out some, the granulomas there, surrounded by dense inflammation in the myocardium, and some more here. We're able to see this is giant cell also. I was very surprised. So we went back to the specimen, and this is another one we're showing some fibrosis also. So we went back to the specimen, took some sections. The closest we could identify was some scarred-like area, and there were some yellowish necrotic areas. So I said, okay, then this looks like somewhat like TB. And we took a lot of sections from everywhere. So what we saw that was interventricular, intramyocardial, subendocardial, pericardial, everywhere the granulomas were there. AFB, GMS done many times negative. The coronaries and the valves were unremarkable. That is all I think there's nothing great about it, but we could see some granulomas are very surrounding perivascular location, raising a possibility of whether it is sarcoidosis or something like that. But if you see, there's a lot of necrosis there everywhere. Even the epicardium, everything was showing TB. So this was a surprise to the surgeons. And so then the first month post-transplant endomyocardial biopsy, so we received 4 fragments. This is the one. So these are the 2 fragments where you should look for something slightly busy here and something else which will slowly enlarge. So you see this, there was some inflammation in the interstitium, not much of any myocyte damage, maybe one fiber, something here and there. So I said, okay, it's just mild rejection. I was considering that. But what caught my eye was the inflammation here. There's a lot of busyness is there. Some histiocytoid type of cells were there, and I said, okay, let me take a deeper cut. And I think again, this is another granuloma here, and so this was again a shock to the transplant team. In such a short span of time, this patient had a granuloma here, and this is the enlarged version of this granuloma there. So, and when we did a C4D, as per the guidelines, C4D was negative, and CD68 did not highlight any intravascular macrophages. So my diagnosis was like mild ACR1R with non-necrotizing granulomatous myocarditis and PAMR 0. So if you look at the infections during the post-transplant time, this is one of the beautiful table here. So you can see that myocardium tuberculosis can occur either in the intermediate time or in the late phase, but none of them has been described in the heart. And it doesn't find a place in the list of diseases which can recur in the allograft. Moreover, the closest cousin is the sarcoidosis, but this patient was somehow not looking like sarcoidosis at that time. And in somewhere between 2-3 months later, he developed lymphadenopathy, and the PET scan was done. And you can see this PET scan highlighting the heart. There you can see that, and the nodes are also positive. And there's another node here in the cervical node, and this was showing necrotizing granulomas. So during this time, the immunosuppression was not tapered off also to consider any immune reconstitution syndrome. The immunosuppression was maintained, but a slight reduction in the Visolone was there. So this patient, I gave again a necrotizing granulomatous lymphadenitis. But this time, gene expert was negative, and this patient was started on ATT because there was so much involvement of heart and the transplant heart and the lymph nodes were there. So after this, while this was going on, the patient 3rd month endomyocardial biopsy was done. And you can see this is a beautiful, clean, neat biopsy. And there was, the C4D is almost like more than 50% diffuse strong positivity. Everywhere was positive. So that's the reason I gave a PAMR1 I+. So there was no histological features like other endothelial activation or any other necrosis or anything, myocyte necrosis, nothing was there. So it is more of an C4D deposition. So now our team was a little, they were stuck with this 2 problems now. Should we treat the ATT and reduce the immunosuppression, or we should increase the immunosuppression? What to do? So there you see the stages of AMR. The patient was somewhere here maybe, but slowly he was going towards the clinical side. And the patient was, the DSA was negative. So if you see the guidelines, what most of the transplant team follows, in this patient, our patient was somewhere here where there was not much of any graft dysfunction. The DSA was negative and PAMR 1+. So here the patient was, and they didn't want to check whether it was because of this AMR, antibody-mediated rejection. The patient couldn't afford this cost of the non-HL antibodies and other things, and they were not sure of the role of what display. I would like the other speakers to comment upon that. And the patient was given a pulse, then increased dose of MMF, then the mTOR inhibitors were added, and tacrolimus was continued. So why am I presenting this case? Because is this the first case? I didn't find any PubMed literature on support of a recurrent or a reinfection of an transplant heart by TB. Then even though this pan-cardiac involvement was there, the patient was MAN2 and TB quantifier negative. Probably this can be explained by that patient was immunosuppressed already. So that's the reason probably they didn't react. Then I have stopped giving reports without seeing the deep cuts. So this is how any transplant biopsy, I take a further deep cuts to be very sure. And the patient is due for 3rd biopsy 6 weeks. So if the next ISOT thinks that want to know about this, probably they should invite me for another case in the next ISOT. This is one table which I really like in one of the articles here. just compared where, in which organ you should interpret, how should the C4D be interpreted. This is the article, Archives of Pathology Lab Medicine. And thank you, ISOT team. Sincere thanks for patient hearing. The good news is I'm not doing any review of literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Satish. That was a really nice case, very intriguing. So what do you think? So you think that the tuberculosis was not, it was an infection which was already persistent in the patient, which went to the transplant heart,
Yes.
or do you think it was a new infection that could have occurred?
No, ma'am, before transplant, also the patient had lymphadenopathy. He was biopsied there, and I think some other node was biopsied, not the mediastinal nodes or anything. And that time he was given ATT because of that time. Later on, he never had those symptoms, this thing. But during the transplant, also the lymphadenopathy was there. They got worried when after post-transplant started increasing in size. And when endomyocardial biopsy is given, and we saw that granuloma there were really, two problems at the same time.
Right. Very interesting case. So was the ATT given, it had the whole course of ATT? And did the size of the lymph nodes decrease after the course of the ATT before the patient was transplanted?
No, ma'am. The ATT was given before he came to transplant, 2018. He was transplanted in 21 because of all the COVID things and all those. He was probably avoiding. After the endomyocardial biopsy, when the PET scan was done, he started having enlarged lymph nodes. Then the ATT was, when the biopsy we said again it's a TB again, then they started ATT.
Do we have any other comments? So how do these patients get treated? So this patient will now again receive the whole course of ATT. And what about ABMR?
Yeah, and that's a good question, ma'am. Usually in these patients, the rifabutin has to be given, which is more, does not interfere with TAC levels. But I think it's not available in India, I guess. I think in our Hyderabad, it's not available. So he has been given rifampicin for some time, and then it has been reduced slowly. At present, he seems to be stable, and he is due for another endomyocardial biopsy. Then we'll be able to tell you. That's the reason I joked whether in the next ISOT I will present.
Yeah, I think the second biopsy, you need to plan on elaborate cultures and microbiology studies.
Yes, sir. Yes.
To send fresh tissue for that. Now that we know that he has a granuloma, I think after that.
Ma'am, but because the first biopsy was showing granuloma, then the lymph node was showing a granuloma. The lymph node was sent for quantiferon and everything. It was all negative. The second endomyocardial biopsy didn't show any granuloma, although it was sent for quantiferon gold and everything. It was sent for gene expert and everything. Still, it was negative.
Yeah. Maybe infection, something other than TB. I don't know.
Ma'am, non-mycobacterial culture was done, madam. It was also negative.
Okay.
So all this workup was done, and they said they have to treat it like TB only. So he seems to be stable now, but
yeah, and it's possible that this infection has triggered off the rejection also.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's what. Any infection would trigger off. So that's what we are expecting. This probably next biopsy probably I'll update again.
Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Satish, that was a very nice case. But what about the ANCA antibodies in this patient? Were they negative?
Which one, ma'am? ANCA.
The ANCA antibodies, were they negative? The PNC ANCA?
I think they were done, ma'am. I don't have the data, ma'am. That's a good question. I will inquire, but it was probably not thought of actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that could also be one possibility that needs to be looked into.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. That's a good suggestion.
So thank you, Dr. Satish. That was a really nice case. And I now hand over to the organizers. This is the end of the session.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It's
speakers, chairpersons, and moderators for your time. Thank you, audience.